All right, I can't resist this. Every time anybody mentions that Pulitzer thing, I have to tell this story. And those of you who know my wife will appreciate it. It's a little embarrassing for me, but I called home, right? I mean, I didn't go anywhere. It was nominated. Nothing happened, but it was a big deal for me. So I called home and said, guess what? I've been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Silence. You? You've got to be kidding. Which leads me into the talk, right? Historians were used to being ignored, not taken seriously, dismissed, but we're at a different period. We're at a period now where we run the risk of being targeted and assaulted for doing what we, as responsible historians, think we should do, and that is to complicate history. And as Jared indicated, we're in a moment now where the country is going to commemorate its 250th anniversary. Is that going to be mindless celebration, or is it going to be a moment for thoughtful reflection? There will be lots of people like you guys, like this. I probably get an invitation a week to go and talk somewhere because everybody's doing something for the 250th. But they ask me because they realize that the old straightforward narrative of the 250th isn't enough. We have to include other people. And that, I think, is as it should be. But for some people, that is heresy, un-American, which is never something that really bothered me, or radical left-wing takeover or something. It's not. It's just good history. Because history is not the same as the past. History is the stories we tell, or even tell ourselves around the past, which then prompts the all-important question: who gets to decide whose stories get to be told? Who gets to decide that our origin story, the American Revolution, is history? But these guys over here, these indigenous people who also have origin stories, their stories are fairy tales. And what I hope will happen this year is that people will entertain the possibility that freedom can mean different things to different people. And the freedom can mean the same, different things to the same people in different circumstances. And be skeptical, at least, of people who claim a monopoly on freedom. So the Declaration of Independence, as you probably know, includes a phrase that talks about how King George has unleashed the merciless Indian savages on the frontiers of America. And that's not actually true at the time. And the first native people to be fighting in the Revolution were probably Stockbridge Indians from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, who had gone to Boston to fight with Washington. But that, of course, is in the Declaration of Independence, so that's got to be gospel truth, because this is a foundational document. And it's reinforced by this. This is also an iconic painting by John Vanderlyn, done in 1804, long after the Revolution's over. But it almost reinforces that this is what Indians did in the Revolution. This is what Indians do. Okay? Indians fought against the United States at the moment of his birth. So how can they expect to be granted a place in this new nation based on liberty? Because they are the enemies of liberty. Well, the Declaration of Independence triggers a war of independence, of course. For Americans, it's independence from Britain. But it's also a war to get access to Indian land. For Native Americans, it's a war to defend their land, but it's also a war for independence. It's basically against Americans. So that gets a little iffy. And it opens up the basic fact, I would call it, not a radical reinterpretation, but it's just what it is. That this is a nation built on indigenous land. Now, I've been saying that for 40 years. I remember the very first time I said it, it was in my large US history class at the University of Wyoming. And after class, 4 very large students with very large hats came into my office and had a problem with it. But if you think about it, here it is. Right? This was all Indian country, and now it's not. Right? George Washington didn't have a problem with it. George Washington said as much. For this country to grow and prosper, we need to move west, develop, add states, and all that will happen on Western lands. Western lands means indigenous land. So how does this all happen? So this is a map, like so many maps, that is fantasy because it shows British territory, territory ceded by France, and Spanish territory. And there's somebody missing, right? Native nations, hundreds of them, who are the people who control most of this territory. But at the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it's called, Britain acquired a massive empire, not just in North America, but around the world. But in North America, France ceded to Britain all its territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. Right? And Britain really didn't know what to do with it. But one thing it did want to try and do is prevent recurrent Indian wars. And to do that, it did 2 things. One, it kept an army in North America. And an army of 10,000 men in the 18th century was a hugely expensive proposition. So who's going to pay for that? Well, Britain was taxed to the hilt at the end of this global war it just fell. So the answer in London seemed obvious. Okay, well, let's tax the American colonists because the army's being left there to protect American colonists. British citizens, subjects can't pay any more taxes. Let's have the American colonists pay that share. Well, we all know where that went, right? The other thing they did is draw this line down, basically it's the Appalachian Trail. And it's an attempt to regulate the frontier, right? And say that this is all British territory, it's all pink, right? But west of the Appalachians is an Indian reserve. Right? British citizens, American colonists, should stay west of that, east of that line, and west of that line is Indian country. It doesn't mean it will always be Indian country, but sales of land will be conducted in open council above board between the king's representatives and the tribal representatives. And so you won't have this scramble for land. You won't have squatters on Indian land. You won't have speculators investing in Indian land. Well, that made sense in London. It made people see red in North America. Settlers, because they were the people doing the squatting, and many of them continued to do so. And speculators, because people like George Washington had been speculating in those lands for decades and waiting for the day when France would be defeated. The Indian nations west of the Appalachians would not have a European ally. Anglo-American settlers would swarm over the mountains and they'd make a killing. it seemed to George Washington and other people like him who had fought as British subjects for the empire in the war, that this was a slap in the face, and that the door to riches were being shut in their face. This it was not designed to be a permanent line, and of course it was an imaginary line. When these things were, we used to get it. I tried this with my students, tell them they've already forgotten. We used to say they were going to build a wall, but they couldn't get the Indians to pay for it. They didn't get it. I thought it was a good one. Anyway, but what that does, the French and Indian War, and you cannot have a French and Indian War without Indians. The French and Indian War produced the conditions and the developments that lead directly to the American Revolution. So that when the American Revolution breaks out, this is a huge question. It's a huge question for American colonists who want that land, and it's a huge question for native people who want to keep their land. And they look at the British, and it's not as if they're in love with the Brits, but they think, well, at least there's some record there of Britain trying to protect our land. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, 9 days after it was written, it was read at the Treaty of Watertown in Massachusetts. And the Treaty of Watertown in Massachusetts was between the Americans, basically between George Washington, who was at Boston, and the Eastern Indians, Penobscots, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq. So I wonder how that landed when the reading of the Declaration came to that sentence that referred to merciless Indian savages. Because according to the record, the Eastern Indian response was, "We like it well." Well, I'm not sure why. Maybe they just mumbled over that line or something. But follow up to that, the day before George Washington and his army crossed the Delaware, right? This is a pivotal, it's an iconic moment in American history. Goodness, 8 years ago, I spent half a year down at Mount Vernon at the George Washington Library. And there were images or reproductions of what says Washington crossing the Delaware. You all know that. They're everywhere. They're on the wall. They were on the breakfast table, on the table mats. This is huge, and we all know what that means, right? This was a pivotal moment. The revolution, the success of the revolution, hung on this. If it had gone wrong, that would have been it. So the day before that happens, on the eve of this, most momentous, most pivotal moment, perhaps, in the American Revolution, and therefore perhaps American history. That's not the only thing on George Washington's mind. He writes a letter to the Eastern Indians, to the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, saying, "Don't forget we're allies," urging them to remain steadfast because he recognizes that he needs them, that the revolution needs them. And George Washington understood what we forgot. And that is that in the 18th century and even into the early 19th century, Native Americans were still a power in the land. And that if you looked at a map of North America, you did not see and you did not imagine the United States as we know it. Right? There were lots of possibilities. An American state, a British state, a Spanish state, and one or more indigenous states. There were all kinds of possibilities. We tend to teach American history, by which I mean everybody but me. We tend to treat American history as if it's preordained, right? How did things come to be this way? You've all seen those maps, in fact I usually have, that shows how the United States developed. 13 original colonists, right? Louisiana Purchase, and then all that Western territory that comes with the war against Mexico. And it's almost like, well, of course, it was meant to be. It's all, in a sense, domestic territory falling into place. So how can it possibly be an empire? Because an empire is something that other people do. Brits and Romans do that. Well, George Washington called it an empire. Thomas Jefferson called it an empire of liberty. But they both understood what was happening. And so did the Cherokees. Right? This is a map that I spent a long time sort of pulling together. So I'm going to show you whether it's relevant to talk or not. But what it shows is the Cherokees' experience leading up to and immediately after the American Revolution. And just a glance at it, right? Cherokees lost land, lost land, lost land, lost land. So when the revolution happened, Cherokee faced a dilemma. They went to war against the British in 1759-60, and the British invaded Cherokee country. Highland regiments, probably some of my ancestors, burnt their towns, burnt their crops. So when the revolution happens, what are they going to do? The older chiefs said, well, we're not going to make the same mistake we did before. We will continue the policy that we've had of selling off land. It buys us time. But younger Cherokee guys could not swallow that, because if you were an 18th century Cherokee male, your identity, your status, your masculinity, I guess, depended on two major things: establishing a record in war and hunting. All the chiefs had done that, had achieved that status, and were now occupying a much more prestigious rank as elder statesmen, if you like. And it was okay for them to say, well, we shouldn't go to war again. For younger Cherokees, if you don't go to war and your dad's sold off the land and there's no land to hunt, where does that leave you? So somebody was talking about a civil war in somebody was talking about revolution being a civil war for 6 years, civil war. It was that, but it was also very often a civil war in Indian country. So for the Cherokees, this was a generation where younger Cherokees went to war, and then the surrounding colonies, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia, immediately sent expeditions into Cherokee country, burning villages, destroying crops, and the older chiefs then had to patch up a peace with these colonists, the price of which was to cede more land. And younger Cherokees, led by a guy called Chinkanassina, migrated west and continued the war, which was a dangerous thing to happen for all Cherokees, because one of the patterns that was recurrent during the Revolution and during American history, I hate to say, but during the Revolution, is that American militia, American armies looking for Indians to kill did not discriminate between one Indian or another. So Cherokees from Tennessee, who raided American settlement, created mayhem. American militia retaliated, but they didn't go all the way to Tennessee looking for Dragon Canoes warriors. They burned the same Cherokee villages that they came to. So Cherokees are a good example of the issues that this war throws up for Indian people. How do they preserve their land, and how do they preserve their independence? Because the two things are intertwined. And when we talk about freedom and colonists wanting freedom, or land hungers. Often people in Native American studies will do it, just say, dismiss colonist motives as land hungry. But what that means in the 18th century is land equals economic freedom. Land equals economic independence. Because you've got a huge family, right? And so you need land for yourselves, but you also need land for your children. And these are people who've come from Scotland, Ireland, Germany, wherever, where there is no land. There's plenty of land, but you don't own it. Economic freedom is owning your own land. So you give up your homeland and your attachment to those lands in your country in exchange for real estate in a land to which you have no attachment. I'm not sure that's always a good bargain. Continuing the theme of evolution. The League of the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse in upstate Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and by this time Tuscaroras. The metaphor for their league was that they constituted a longhouse. And the Mohawks guarded the eastern door, and the Senecas guarded the western door, and the Onondagas were the keepers of the central council file, where the wampum bells and the treaty records and all those things kept. There is a moment at the Treaty of Lancaster in 1744 where Kenneth Turner, who was an Onondaga speaker, says to the colonists with whom he's meeting, which are colonists from Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, he says, you know what, if you guys want to amount to anything, you individual colonists, you need to do what we've done. You need to put them together and form a union. Don't be squabbling with each other all the time, but form a union, and that will make you strong and respected. It's an interesting moment, and it's also an interesting coincidence that Kenneth Ortega says that on July 4th, 1744. And Benjamin Franklin knew about that because Benjamin Franklin was a printer, and Benjamin Franklin was always printing treaties, including this one. So he definitely was aware of this. And that league had served the Haudenosaunee well, not only in the 17th century when it made the military strong, but also through the 18th century when they'd relied on diplomacy rather than war to exercise their sway by saying to the French and the English, we're going to stay out of your wars, and we're going to be more or less remain neutral. And you need to respect our neutrality, and we'll play one against the other. And you can see that, the Treaty of Lancaster, for one example, the British are handing out presents to the Iroquois Lancaster, which there were 250 Iroquois turned up for that treaty. This is Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in 1744. Right? It suddenly becomes an Indian town, right, with a handful of colonists. The British are handing out gifts, and the Iroquois people are saying, well, yeah, these are nice, but when we go to Montreal, boy, those guys know how to throw a party. And they were doing the same thing in Montreal. Right? And they knew what they were doing. They had power, and they knew how to use it. But, of course, France was defeated the 7 Years' War. And when the revolution happens, this is a major crisis for the Haudenosaunee. Because what will the Haudenosaunee do? The way this worked was the decisions were made by consensus. The Mohawks would have to agree among themselves. The Senecas would have to agree. Mohawks and Cayugas, Senecas and Cayugas would agree. Mohawks and Oneidas would agree. And at the end of that laborious process, you would have unity, right? Everybody had kind of bought into this. Years ago, when I was, Susan will appreciate this, years ago when I was chairing NAS, I was in a meeting where Barry Shear was trying to get the various interdisciplinary programs to be more systemized. You know, who's on your masthead, who gets to vote, etc. And he was going around the room, and people were saying how they did their voting and who got to vote. And I was sort of shrinking in my chair, hoping they wouldn't get to me. And they finally did, and they said, well, we've never had a vote. We don't vote. We just sort of do it by consensus. It seems to work, right? And that wasn't an imitation of that. It's just that it is another system. And if it works, it can be very effective. But this doesn't work now because this is a choice that allows no neutrals. So most of the Iroquois, people like Joseph Brand, who's a Mohawk, side with the British, friend of Sir William Johnson, son-in-law Sir William Johnson, side with the British. And he's an interesting guy. He'd been to London twice. Went to London twice, 1776, and then after the war in 1784. And he met with the kings and queens and aristocrats and dukes. And he went out at night with the Prince of Wales and visited some places that he thought very strange for a prince to go. Where's he been? They're talking about the royal family, right? We know what the princes do. But he's also, I became a big fan of Joseph Brown 50 years ago when I was doing my graduate work in archives in London, working through British Indian Department records. And I'd see a Joseph Brown letter coming up, and I'd be so grateful because Joseph Brown was taught to read and write by Ebenezer Wheeler. Not here, but at his school down in Connecticut. So his handwriting was actually legible, unlike these other guys in the British Indian Department from Scotland and Ireland, and seemed to be drunk at the time, you know. That's right. But again, it gives the light to that notion that, well, you can't tell Indians because Indians didn't produce any records. If we published the papers of Joseph Brown, this would be a couple of volumes of correspondence. And he was always getting his portrait then because it was a big deal. But the Oneidas didn't. Oneidas sided with the Americans for a variety of reasons, probably religious. Samuel Kirkland was a missionary to the Oneidas. And this is a sculpture, again, at the National Museum of the American Indian, I think it's not at the Museum of the Revolution. And it shows George Washington, obviously, with Holly Cooper, an Oneida woman, and Shenandoah, Shenandoah, and a couple of bears, right, which are not bears, that's their clan. Right? But you'll see she's holding Colin, and the story is, and it's prominent and retold in the Oneida community, that Oneidas traveled down to Valley Forge when Washington's army was starving to death and took Colin. Now, Oneidas definitely went down there, and Oneidas fought alongside Marquis de Lafayette down there. The Colin story maybe is harder to document, but it's nonetheless the case that the Oneidas side with the Americans. The Battle of Oriskany in 1777, Oneidas and Senecas and Mohawk meet in battle. Now, one of the strengths of this confederacy, this league, was that if you were Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Tioga, Seneca, you were a member of a clan. You were Bear Clan, Fiddle Clan, Red Clan, whatever. So if you traveled from Mohawk country to Seneca country, you would have clan relatives that the other side of Iroquois. One's killing each other, then literally brothers are killing brothers. And this is a brutal war. And the brutality of the war on the frontier prompts George Washington in 1779 to send a huge expedition out into Iroquois country, led by General John Sullivan, who was a New Hampshire attorney from Durham, Dover, one of those D towns down by the coast. A real grumpy guy, actually. But John Sullivan, Clinton, coming up, Delgany was brought in. And this is a pincer attack on Iroquois country. And George Washington sent more of the Continental Army to that than to any other campaign. He was serious about this. And he micromanages it. He's sending Sullivan instructions all the time. He gathers surveys. Where are the towns? Where are the places where Iroquois people are most vulnerable? And he says to Sullivan, and do not allow them to talk peace until you have achieved your mission, which is to destroy Iroquois country. And Sullivan reports that he burns 40 towns, destroys 160,000 bushels of corn, and cuts down innumerable orchards. And you can read Sullivan's officers' journals, and they talk about the army. There's a few skirmishes with Indian people, but mainly what they're doing is burning villages, destroying crops in the ground and storehouses full of corn, and cutting down orchards. And once a guy, I think he was the guy on the history of the apple in America. We wrote a book on Johnny Appleseed. And he said, well, of course they did that. Because if you burn cornfields, people can replant. Actually, that was part of the scheduling of these attacks. When the British are doing it, or Washington's doing it here, you schedule your campaign late summer, early fall. So you burn all the corn that's in the field, and it's too late in the season to plant another crop. Destroying an orchard takes more time. But as Bill was telling me, he said, but that's because orchards take a long time. It's a long time of energy and human investment. And by destroying orchards, you're basically sending the message there's nothing for you to come back to. And this campaign is followed by what's reputedly the coldest record in history in New York. And it creates a refugee crisis for the British at Fort Niagara, because Haudenosaunee people driven from their own villages and facing starvation and exposure take refuge at Fort Niagara. I've walked over the ground where their camps were, and there they died of disease. They suffered from hunger, all kinds of problems. In part because, of course, Fort Niagara is dependent on supplies coming across the Great Lakes from Montreal and Quebec. And the lakes were frozen. So come the spring, what happens is that Haudenosaunee warriors are going back to the frontiers of Pennsylvania and New York, raiding not only to get revenge, but also to get food to feed their families. So this scorched earth policy is not particularly effective. But it's also why does Washington send so many troops there? So much of the Continental Army going to there. He's doing more than retaliating for Iroquois attacks. He's ensuring a future In 1779, France has been in the war 2 years. Once France enters, I don't think there's any doubt the United States is going to win its independence. But what will that independence look like? What will the treaty terms be? Well, we all know that the treaty terms secured for the United States all the land in Mississippi. But nobody knew that then. And in fact, some of the European powers were trying to manage an agreement whereby peace would be made, independence would be granted, but the territories would remain as they were. And George Washington said that's a no-go. Unless we have territory in the West, land in the West to expand into, we will be a piddling little nation. Right? He's getting boots on the ground. He wants to claim this. And when you read the accounts of the officers, they're talking about what a lot of these guys are from New Hampshire, right? Vermont. Where when they're not in the army, they're doing what my wife's family did in the spring, you're harvesting rocks. This is Finger Lakes country, right? With incredibly rich topsoil. So a lot of these guys at the end of the war are in the starting blocks. If we can only get rid of the Indians, there's this wonderful land there for the taking, right? And that's what Washington wanted. So once the war is over, that land that Britain had retained from France now is transferred from Britain to the United States. It's a little bit like a big board game in which territories pass back and forward between European powers and colonial powers. And everybody but the Native Americans know the rules. The question now is what will become of that land? If you look at this map, you'll see that this land was still claimed in 1787 by Virginia, by North Carolina, and by South Carolina, and by Georgia. When colonies were formed, the Crown very often gave them charters with land grants that, in the case of Virginia, in the case of Georgia, stretched as far as the Western Sea. That's the Pacific. Nobody knew what the hell it was, but it's out there. Which meant that these individual colonies that won their independence now have these incredible claims to land that they're asking themselves, do we really want to give these up to the federal government? Or shouldn't we keep them for ourselves? The idea that, as somebody was mentioning this before, you declare independence and instantly you've got the United States, is us looking backwards. This was a very precarious time for the nation, for the United States. It was a big question whether the United States could even become a nation, because a lot of the 13 colonies fought for their independence. And they're worried about now handing over so much of that independence to a central government. Well, didn't we just stop doing that? Okay? And especially in the Atlantic. But in the North, partly Virginia, but Pennsylvania, New York, etc., ceded their land claims to the federal government. So the first place for the federal government can really say, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to build a nation? Is in what's called the Northwest Territory. And in the Northwest Ordinance, Congress does something I think is brilliant. And it's not often they use Congress and brilliant in the same sentence. But you think about what had happened. The colonies, the British colonies, had rebelled against their rightful king in what was a bloody revolution. Right? It was a violent, radical revolution. But the people who led it are still the people who are leading this in, embryonic country. They don't want to be seen as radicals. They're men of property. So they want this to seem a reasonable, responsible, almost organic thing to do. So the way it's pitched is, well, if colonies were children of the mother country, we owed debts to Britain, and Britain protected us, the trade with Britain, etc. But like all children, we grew up, we became strong, and it was time for us to leave home and create our own nation. Well, okay, fair enough. What happens if Wisconsin does the same thing? 100 years later, 50 years later, say, well, okay, yeah, we started out as an American territory, but now we're older, wiser, and stronger. We don't need the United States anymore. They've got to stop. And so the Northwest Ordinance, Northwest Territory, does that. What it does is establish what's called the territorial system in the United States. And that is that when 5,000 people occupy a region, it becomes a territory. And it has a territorial government modeled on a state government. When the population reaches 60,000 people, that territory can then petition the United States to enter the Union on the same terms as all the other states. So unlike a British colony, where once a colony, always a second-class citizen, an American territory is a temporary situation. It's a phase. It's a step on the way to statehood. And that's how most of the states in the country enter the Union. Of course, it's predicated on the fact that Americans will keep moving west and going into new land, Indian land, to establish these territories. And Washington and his government want this to be an orderly process. So they also say, and when we do this, we'll establish townships, land will be surveyed, measured, there'll be square miles and sections, etc., 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 which you can still see. We fly across the middle of America and look down, everything's big squares. You fly across England or Scotland and look down. So this is a brilliant solution to the problem of how do we keep the territories loyal to the United States? How do we make the territories and the citizens who occupy those territories agents, if you like, of empire building or nation building? But there's another piece to it, and it's in the same document where it says, and we also pledge that we will do fairly and honestly with Indian people, and will never invade their lands except in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. Want your cake and eat it too, right? How can you do that? This whole thing is predicated on taking land from native people. But this is a government, a very new government, a new nation, that's conscious of how it will look. And George Washington and Henry Knox, his Secretary of War, who's ultimately responsible for Indian affairs, spent a lot of time and ink wrestling with them. Not with shall take the Indians' land, that's a gift, but how do we do it honorably? Because we need to do this so that we satisfy our own consciences, we satisfy our own citizens, we look up to the nations of the world who are watching us, we look good to native peoples, and we also look good to posterity. They were very conscious about this being a new nation and establishing precedent. one of the things I came away from Mount Vernon with, having paid $14.95 for it, was a facsimile copy of George Washington's copy of the Constitution, which the library at Mount Vernon had just paid $8 million to get that. So I have that. What's fascinating, the reason I shelled out $14.95 is not just another copy of the Constitution, it's got George Washington's little notes on it. There's not many, but what he does, he sits down and reads it. I sit and reading the Constitution. Reads the Constitution and pencils in the president, president, president. This is the document that will guide me in my new job as president. And so they were very conscious about, if we go beyond this or anything we do, we can set precedent. So that means this think area now becomes the target for American expansion. And it has been for a long time. This is Shawnee country. I don't know anything about this painting. I found it by accident a few days ago looking for something else. But it purports to be Shawnees. But Shawnees had been displaced from the Ohio Valley and then had come home. Delaware people from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, had been driven west and taken refuge in the Ohio Valley. This was a collecting point for Indigenous nations. One Cayuga leader refers to it as a republic of nations, not tribes, nations. A republic of nations. What's happening there is, as the United States is forming a confederation to expand west, Native people form a confederation to resist that confederation. And they'd been taking it in the neck during the Revolution because the Americans at Fort Pitt and the British at Detroit had been waging war back and forward, and Delaware's Shawnees and Wendat and Miami people were caught in the middle. And some of the most brutal atrocities that took place in the war took place then. In 1782, for instance, American militia marched to a village called Nardenham, which means tents of grace in German, because this was a Moravian mission village inhabited by Delaware people who had converted to the Moravian faith, which meant they were Christian, and they were also pacifists. To the Western Pennsylvania militia, they were merciless Indian savages. And the Westmoreland militia arrived at this village, had a debate and a vote about how these people should be killed, and divided them up into men, women, and children. And the next day, systematically bludgeoned 96 men, women, and children to death with butcher's mallets while the Indians were singing hymns. And of course, this is 1782, right? That just sent the Western frontier into madness. One of my criticisms of the Ken Burns movie, and we had a conversation about that, and he won, was why stop at Yorktown? Right? For Indigenous peoples, for Native people, the revolution, fighting of the revolution goes on long after that. And in fact, the Indians are winning until 1783, when the British sell them down the river. But the war for Indian land continues for at least another year, because now Americans are insistent that they have to get that land. So how are you going to get that land? This is the Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and later Thomas Jefferson way of thinking through this for us. So ideally, you will get that land by making treaties with Indian peoples, Native nations. That's what the Brits had done. And that's the fair and honourable way to do it. We'll give them a fair price for their land. They will give us their land. Everybody's happy. The problem is, what if the native people say, well, no thanks, but no thanks? Then, you see this in Washington's writing, the whole changes. Then these are not native nations with whom we should deal honorably. These are recalcitrant savages who must be crushed. Now, Washington was no genocidal mania. Washington wanted this to be a nation that operated in Indian country on treaties. When the Constitution was written, one of the first things Washington does is point to that clause that says treaties have to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. He writes to the Senate, he says, and that includes Indian treaties. And once that happens, once the president says, Indian treaties are the supreme law of the land, and still are. It's always struck me as odd, I've moved on this, I guess, since I was 6, that you've got these revered documents in this country. You've got the Declaration of Independence, which is like a sacred text. You've got the Constitution that people used to revere. One secures independence, or proclaims independence. One creates a system of government. And the third, Indian treaties, secures the land base. But it doesn't get included in that sort of pantheon of documents. Most people just ignore it and say, well, they got broken anyway. But the treaties, once they're made, with the law of the land. That was George Washington, that was his preference. But this time didn't have it, then we will teach them a lesson. We will take the land by force. And that in 1791, that's what George Washington decided to do. He wanted to pull off a Sullivan campaign in the Ohio country, and he dispatched a general by the name of Arthur Sinclair to lead an American army into Ohio to push north into western Ohio, destroy a villages called Kimball, burn the villages, burn the crops, and that would be take the Indians out. The campaign went badly from the beginning. Contractor fraud is nothing new in American history. It was delayed so that soldiers are sleeping in flimsy tents with flimsy clothing, and it's already snowing in Ohio in October. Right? And on November 4th, 1791, members of the Native American Confederation, Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wanda, attacked that army and not only defeated, they destroyed. About 1,400 men, more than 900 casualties. What's left of the army goes limping back home. When the news of that defeat reaches Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson said, nobody talked about anything else. This is a country that's 50 years old. It has barely yet formed a government. It has barely yet established the infrastructure of a nation. It's threatened by the British in the north, Spaniards in the south, and powerful Indian nations. And now it's totally defenseless because this wasn't just an American army. This was the American army. This was a major, major crisis. So we don't want to repeat that. Get land by treaty if you can. Try and avoid going to war because that's a risky business. If you are going to go to war, you want to try and burn villages, but even that backfires. But there's a better way. And it's here on the George Washington Peace Medal. And every American president from George Washington up to the 20th century, the exception of Benjamin Harrison, I think, gives out peace medals. So you're a native person, you visit Washington or the Indian nation gives you a peace medal. And they follow this model. So here's George holding his hand out to a Native American. George is still holding his sword that the native guy has put down his tomahawk and there's a Calloway piece. So they're going to live together in peace. There'll be a future of peace. But look at what the future looks like in the background. Right? A guy standing behind a plough pulled by oxen and living in a log cabin. Right? Well, how does that work? Well, the way this works is if you're George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or anybody else concerned with American Indians at this time, you see, these people are doomed to extinction if they continue to be savages, hunters. The only way that they have a chance to survive is if they give up that savage hunting way of life and become farmers like us. Now, of course, if you've been paying attention, you say, wait a minute, Calloway, you're doing it again, contradicting yourself when you're talking about these extensive cornfields. Who the hell's growing all this corn? Well, that's the question. The wrong people are growing the corn. It's Cherokee and Iroquois women who are growing the corn. You've got the guys and men growing the corn, doing the farming, and the women doing appropriate domestic jobs. Now, the nice thing about farming like this is you work from dawn to dusk behind a plow, but you need much less land to produce the food that you need to live. So therefore, all that surplus extra land that you had for hunting, you don't need that anymore. And you can sell it to us because we know people who would like to buy it. And so this, in some kind of weird way, I suppose, I don't think it's just hypocrisy, satisfies things. Right? It resolves that dilemma. We're going to take land from Indian people, but you know what? It's for their own good. Because the less land they have, the more likely they are to become farmers. And if they become farmers, they have a future. If they continue to live as primitive savage hunters, they're doomed to extinction. So this should work. And this thinking runs through American Indian policy right up into the 20th century, even to the boarding schools. Right? We're going to take your kids from here. We're going to beat them for speaking their own language. We're going to make them live in certain ways. We're going to de-educate them to re-educate them, because unless we do that, they have no chance to survive. And so sometimes in this long story, some of the tragedy is that sometimes the greatest damages are inflicted by people who think they're doing the right thing. And George Washington and the Revolutionary generation, of course, were guilty of that. Because contrary to what we might hear on July 4th, they were not demigods. They were people. They had human failings. They had their own ambitions and interests. And they were faced with situations that really they weren't equipped to solve. Slavery and Indian land. The slavery issue, of course, is going to come back with a vengeance. The South will say, this is states' rights. This is our business. But the first conversations about states' rights are about Indian land. Georgia does not give up its rights to its western land, Creek and Cherokee land, until 1802. And it's a delicate sort of bargaining act that the United States has to follow to get that. One of which is an agreement that when the time comes, the United States government will assist Georgia in dealing with its Indian problem. That means getting rid of Creeks and Cherokees. That's the Trail of Tears. Right? That's where that comes. And why does that come? Why does that suddenly become an issue? Because in 1793, a guy called Eli Whitney invented a cotton gin. So that cotton that had previously been grown and harvested on the coast, which was, I think it's called Long Island cotton, long staple, could now be harvested all the way across the deep south. Right? One of the reasons the founding fathers didn't worry about slavery is it's always going to die out because the cotton industry is going on its knees. Settlements is a massive injection. So you now need, in a hurry, to get rid of Indian people in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, all that land, open it up to cotton plantations worked by African slaves. So you have this, I like to draw this on a board where this sort of triangle thing. You have African slaves working land taken from Indian people, growing cotton, which is sent to Manchester, England, where that cotton is produced, is woven into cloth by children working abominable hours and horrible conditions in cotton mills because they can do it cheaper than adults. And the good thing about employing children in cotton mills is being in cotton mills and it's like it's snowing. Right? And machinery clogs up. If you stop the machines, production halts, you lose money. If you've got children, they're small enough to send into the machines. So children are losing arms and limbs, etc. Producing cloth, some of which makes it is used for the Indian trade, and some of which goes back to the South to clothe the slaves. Right? So all of this is part of this Atlantic world that is created in many ways by the revolution. The United States wins its independence, but it doesn't win independence from those emotional networks. And now if we, and I love making all those sort of connections.
Yeah.
Students think I know what I'm talking about.
There's one more, Colin, I just became aware of it. The big bridge they're about to rebuild that runs over from Portsmouth over to Maine is called the Sullivan Bridge. It's named for John
That's the
Sullivan.
one. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have some other one.
Sullivan Tunnel.
Yeah. So
Is that the same? Is that named for John Sullivan now? In New York, in Boston, and he goes out to the airport?
Probably a lot of Sullivans in Boston.
There are.
yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
That's good. That's good. Good place. So thank you very much. Sure.
You didn't mention William Penn and what happened in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And that's so Pennsylvania is I just wrote a book about the Scots Irish, so I spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania in my head because I was my book in COVID. So when William Penn establishes Pennsylvania, his idea is that fair and honest dealings with Indian people will be the basis for future good relations. Now, it gets overdone. He's still doing side deals and all that kind of thing, and he's got some pretty sketchy people involved with him. But where Pennsylvania takes a turn is with Penn's sons. And also when when I was writing my book on the Scots Irish, things were happening at the time that made it difficult to write my beginning because I began the book by talking about Paxton boys. These are Scotch Irish frontiers people who kill a bunch of native people, 20 Conestoga Indians, mutilate them, scalp them, etc. And then they march on Philadelphia, right? Threatening to kill Quakers and kill more Indians. What are they doing? They are really venting their exasperation, frustration, and resentment against Eastern elites and the people in the government who they feel pay more attention to Indians than they do to them. people far from the centers of power and privilege lashing out against people of color and then storming the government.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, so it's kind of a bird's music. It's an American story. But what had happened in the meantime was that was that and William Penn's ideal and the Quaker Assembly had lost power. And so the government of Pennsylvania shifted. And this was most blatantly illustrated by a thing called the walking purchase. And I don't have a map of it, but I do have a map of it, but you don't get to see it because I don't have it here. But basically what the William Penn's sons did was produce a document that they said had been made between William Penn and the Delawares, his generation, back in the 1680s, which the Delawares granted to William Penn and his heirs as much land in the Lehigh and the Delaware Valley as a man could walk in a day and a half. And the Delaware leaders said, well, that's odd because we don't have any memory of that. We don't have belts that record that. There's no oral tradition about that. But yeah, okay, we'll go along with it. And so then what happened was, and what they were thinking, obviously, how far can a man walk in a day and a half? Well, like a picnic, walk, amble along for the morning, sit down, have lunch, smoke a few cigarettes, What they did, Pennsylvanians, was to get a team of 3 runners and prepare the trail, right? So one runner would run like hell until he collapsed, and another runner would run like hell until he collapsed, and then the third one, and they got this huge chunk of land, right? And that was something that Delaware people were complaining about 40 years later. Right? In fact, at the time of the Revolution, they were saying, why would we trust the Americans? We know what they want. They want our land. At least the British tried to protect our land. But at the beginning of the Revolution, sorry to use your question, very good question to go on for another lecture, but here. At the beginning of the Revolution, one of the first treaties that the United States makes is with the Delawares, the Treaty of Fort Pitt. And it's a very short treaty, it's just a defense agreement to be allies. But there's a provision in it that says that when this war is over, the Delaware Nation, if it chooses, shall be the head of an Indian state with delegates in Congress. Well, you can look at that and think, well, that's just hypocrisy, or that's wartime expediency. But that's a remarkable document, one of the first documents. It's so remarkable, in fact, that once I was sitting in my office minding my own business, and the phone rings, and the guy introduced himself as Willie Nelson's songwriter, and said he'd come across, in one of my little books, I talk about this, he'd come across this and he said, blew my mind, man. And I think that was true, or something else was going on. But he wanted to ask if it would be okay for him to write a song for Willie.
So, Colin, I assume you're saying it was not inevitable that when apparently Abigail Adams, according to Joe Ellis last week, lived next to, I forget his name, McGilvery, from the Creek Nation.
Yeah,
They actually became very close. She became a sort of honorary grandmother of, by appointment at least. And there was even some hope of her mediating between the Creek Nation to do the same thing, to set up a Creek state.
Yep. But the flying that on
High in the sky.
So what he's talking about in 1790, George Washington invited delegates from the Creek Nation, including this guy, Alexander McGillivray, who's mostly by descent Scots. to New York, which is then the capital. Right? This is not the new nation flexing its muscles so much as a state visit. Right? It's like King Charles coming. Right? Because Georgia and the Creeks were about on the verge of going to war. If that happened, Spain would come in on the side of the Creeks. The United States would be pulled in on Georgia. And as Henry Knox reminded George Washington, the Creek Nation can muster 5,000 warriors, 5,000 gunmen. The United States Armed Forces at this moment total 500 men. They're in West Point, not this very. So you can't afford to go to war with the Creek. So you invite them to Washington, yes. Abigail Adams calls in her diary that some of the Creeks are living next door and they're back for dinner, etc. It all seems very harmonious, but that treaty is odd because in that treaty, the Creeks make the same concessions to the United States that the year previously they refused to make when American commissioners went to Creek country. And the reason for that you don't see when you look at the treaty. You have to look at the secret articles that are appended to the treaty, where basically Washington and Henry Knox bribe Alexander McGillivray. So Alexander McGillivray drinks the Kool-Aid, takes the bribe, and sells this land, and then the Creeks delegation go home. So it's, there's everywhere you look, there's a mixture of idealism and cynicism, I suppose. Yeah.
A lot of the things you've been talking about seem to me like they must be a preface to Louisiana Purchase, but I don't know what the linkages might be.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? 1803, I think, the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah. So if we go back here, so Louisiana is more than just Louisiana territory. So the end of the 1680s, a bunch of French guys at the headwaters of the Mississippi stick French flag into the ground. Some French priests chant something, and they claim all of that Louisiana, right, for the French. And what they're claiming is the Mississippi drainage, which means absolutely Ohio, Missouri, it's huge, right? And that's French territory until it's split after the French War. So then it goes to Spain, and then Spain cedes it to Napoleon Bonaparte under pressure on condition that Napoleon not hand it to somebody else. Thomas Jefferson says, so whoever controls New Orleans is our natural enemy. Because what he's looking at is the West. If you're a farmer in Kentucky or Tennessee and you're trying to get crops to market in the East, you don't want to be dragging them over the Appalachians. You want to flow them down the rivers, right? And ship them around. And Spain threatened and sometimes did, sort of flows the Mississippi. So Jefferson in 1803 sends emissaries, John Monroe, Livingston, to Paris to explore the possibility of buying New Orleans. And when they get to Talleyrand, and the French minister said, well, really, have I got a deal for you? Right? And he offers them the whole lot. What the heck is happening? Right? I do a class where I start the class with a picture of a mosquito. I said, most people would show you Thomas Jefferson, but this is the guy. So if you look at this map, you actually can't see. Yeah, it's when France cedes its territory to Britain, then the 7 Years' War, gives up all of France, gives up all of that inland. It does not give up what is now Haiti, which we know of as, as whole Caribbean country. Haiti was what was one of the richest colonies. Now, in early American history, richest colony is a code word for slave colony. Right? It's rich because you have thousands of enslaved African sugar people, sugar juice and sugar, right? Well, if you imagine, this is simplifying everything, but you imagine the American Revolution occurs, France jumps in to get its own back for the defeat in the French. Lafayette's here. This is a revolution ostensibly about freedom and independence and equality. The French, those ideas traveled to France. The French Revolution is liberty, equality, fraternity. You can't keep those kinds of ideas in place. They spread to somewhere like Haiti. There's a massive slave rebellion in Haiti. It's one of the most successful rebellions. Perhaps I think it's the only successful slave rebellion in history. Napoleon, who is looking to rebuild his American empire, has to put it down. Otherwise, he doesn't have control of the Gulf of Mexico. So he keeps sending armies there, and the armies do what British armies have done previously. They die of yellow fever because of that mosquito, right? And so by the time the American emissaries arrive in Paris, he's ready to just unload it, not because of Jefferson's statecraft, but because of the mosquito. Right? And that's where Joe and I disagree. This is all contingent upon all these little things that may have gone differently. Mosquito was a founding father. Well, why not? It should be on Mount Rushmore.
Well, Joe's big comment was the lack of Cherokee unity, Haudenosaunee unity, which ultimately made it necessary to for the Americans to attack them. I don't know what any excuse will do. It goes on and on and on. Continuing.
Well, I think thank you.
I'm sorry.
I think the one point is to think of Indians not as Indians, but as nations. Different nations.
Who invented democracies that we emulate.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
A continent full of nations, each with their own foreign bases. So you have relations with other native nations, and those change. And you have relations with the French and the British, the United States. Yeah.
A few years ago, I attended a talk at Dartmouth that had 4 incredible Native American women. And one thing I remember from their talk was that before Christianity had been brought in, that the women had a lot of power in the tribes, but Christianity promoted the men. And I found that fascinating to learn.
Yeah, I just had a class on treaties where I tell the students reenact a debate in the Cherokee Nation about whether to make a removal treaty or not. One of the issues that comes up, excuse me, is that the women say, how come we're not allowed at the council? We were always allowed at the council. But the constitution that you drew up, modeled on the United States Constitution, does not allow that. We've lost that power. We've lost that. And you're no longer listening to the women. There's a moment in the Lewis and Clark expedition where Lewis, there's lots of moments where Lewis loses it, but he's talking with a group of Native people, and he says, and they allowed their women to speak in council. Well, that doesn't tell you that much about the Indian people. It tells you an awful lot about Lewis's ideas and American society, right? The nature of all of these societies is, you've not only got hundreds of different nations, but they've got hundreds of different social structures. But Haudenosaunee society and Cherokee society, and they're both a replied society, women have tremendous influence. I continue to have so. Cameron and I were talking earlier. One of the reasons why Sir William Johnson is able to make his way in Mohawk society is because, in addition to all the other things he got up to, he married Molly Brown, who was the sister of Joseph Brown and a grandmother, right? So that gave him an entry into that society.
I just think it's really interesting how societies that are like stagnated versus like hunters and gatherers, people who kind of move throughout their territory and land, as woman's pointing out, to have women not be active in those communities would have an entire, I mean, it's obvious, but it would have half the population just not do anything in a situation where, like, you know, you would need the women to be serving more of active roles instead of just, you know,
Yeah.
being kind of sheltered into a role of just domesticity that doesn't really even exist. It's just kind of more of an
Division of labor and balance is really
Yeah.
important. You got to remember that somebody like Jefferson is a man of the Enlightenment, right? So he views the world and views history. He's particularly interested by the Scottish Enlightenment because he had a Scottish Jew. But that said that humanity and civilization developed by stages, right? So you have savagery and then barbarism, and then you went to hunting society, herding society, farming society, etc. So Indian people are at a lower stage, right? But with the right inducement, encouragement, support, they can advance up this kind of ladder. Right? Make them Christians, make them farmers, right? And if eventually they can be like us, right? Now that shifts by the time of Indian removal, certainly with somebody like Andrew Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson looks at Cherokees who by this time they've got a one written language, they've got a newspaper, they've got a government model of the United States. They are sending their kids to school. They are, practicing American style agriculture. They are Cherokee people are largely literate, reading and writing when many of the people are trying to get rid of them can't write their own name. And Americans call the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaw, Seminole, the 5 civilized tribes, right? But Jackson's answer to that is, it doesn't matter what they do, they'll always be Indian. Right? They can't ever change to become like us. It's like a development of a different register of racism, I think. Yes,
One other thing, you mentioned Ken Burns. I saw his program on the American buffalo
yes,
and how the white people wiped them out, the buffalo out, so that the native people wouldn't have food.
yep. It's the Western equivalent of what we're talking about in Sullivan's expedition. The way to defeat Indian people is not to go and fight them in battle. Because St. Clair tried that, and so did George Custer. So you decide to destroy their food supplies. And the buffalo have to go to make way for railroads and also to make way for cattle. Because by that time, the eastern cities are filling up with workers, traveling millions of immigrants to Europe. They're not all yeoman farmers as Thomas Jefferson. They're now working in mines and mills and factories. They have to be fed. Well, they can be fed by cattle on the plains. If you get rid of Indians, if you get rid of buffalo, right? And that's part of that project. And the kind of tragedy of that is all the government of the United States had to do is just let it happen. Because people would just go out and blast away and you can make a small fortune. Yeah. So it's a big tale, yeah.
You have hope. I mean, look at the Native American Studies program at Dartmouth that you and Bruce and others have. I graduated from there 40 years ago. It was tiny.
We're still in recovery.
Oh God! Well, well said. What God? There's so much going on in Indian country.
Yeah.
And in indigenous nations worldwide.
Yep.
It's a different time.
It is.
hopefully things can be better
Yeah,
soon.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's all, sometimes I say to students, it's often about, I said, what you learn from Native American history. Sometimes just surviving is a success. You know,